Okay, thank you very much for this very kind introduction. Thanks for the invitation too. It's an honor to be here, and it was kind of special to see myself, my face on an advertisement saying something like "sold out." I saw it yesterday, so it was nice to see this, of course. So welcome to all of you on this presentation, which will indeed be on my new book. It's actually a little pocket book on disability and healing in Greek and Roman myth. I'm actually a great admirer of the Anglo-Saxon tradition of these little pocket books, and I wanted to be read by people on the tram and on the train. It's actually a thing I like to do when I travel from my place in Altrincham to Manchester. And so when Michael Sharp of CUP in 2022 proposed me to write an element in a new Cambridge Element series, namely the one on Greek and Roman mythology, I didn't hesitate for a moment. So this is only something like 75 pages, my little pocket disability and healing in Greek and Roman myths. Now, I just need to go to the second slide. As was said already, I constantly see people in the waiting room now, and as I am the host, I just have to sort of let them in. Sorry for that. Okay. So let's go to this slide. This is basically what has been done in the last 10, 20 years on the history of disabilities for the ancient world. In a way, it all started, at least for me, with the book by my good friend and colleague, Robert Garland, which you see on the left, and which basically says it all. Disabilities are in one way or another in the eye of the beholder. So Robert Garland's book, first version, came out in 1995 already. 2003, the book by Martha Lynn Rose, The Staff of Oedipus, saw the light. And when I was reading this book many years ago, I thought, well, I once want to write the same thing, same sort of monograph for the Roman Empire, which basically happened in 2018 in the book you see below, My Disabilities and the Disabled in the Roman World. Came out 2018. Next to this, there have been many, many other works, of course. I just mentioned a few. 1997, Daniel Ogden, The Crooked Kings of Ancient Greece, will be important for this monograph too, because in Greece, there seems to have been this tradition of dynasties, even of kings, coping with some kind of disability. Very recent, the one by Carrie Slusansky-Weaver, Marginalized Populations in the Ancient Greek World. I chose to show this to you because this has very much also the perspective of bioarchaeology. And then I also just show also two of my collective volumes. So there's the Disability in Antiquity, which came out with Routledge in 2017, and which has 35 contributors, where we really approach the ancient world from the ancient times, so ancient Mesopotamia and Sumeria, up to early Islam and early Christianity, so up to the 7th century CE. There's also the cultural history of disability in the quite famous Bloomsbury series. The first volume was my privilege also to edit. Okay, so let's start. What am I going to do during this presentation, and what did I do in this book? First of all, I'm not going to present a book in the style of what has sometimes been called the paraphrase industry. So these are, of course, not my words, because I have great admiration for books like Natalie Haynes's very recent Pandora's Jar, and I so much enjoyed also reading Robert Graves' The Greek Myths, the complete and definitive edition. So this is all great. This is written in an English that I, as a non-native speaker, could never achieve. But this is actually not what I wanted to do in this little booklet of mine. I also wanted to extend the notion of Rome and Athens, even the notion of Greece and Rome. More will be included, so I will have a look at the ancient world from a broader perspective. Of course, I cannot even strive for anything that comes close to being exhaustive. I cannot offer you a catalog because that would be huge and that would not be the format of a small pocket. And while writing this, so I basically mainly did this with a professorial fellowship at the University of Bonn, I just understood that we as ancient historians and classicists are really standing on the shoulders of giants. So I have profited so much from research which has already been done in these real encyclopedias from the 19th century. So basically I have built on a whole tradition, but still try to do something new. And one of my research questions would be, why are we interested in this? Why did Cambridge University Press actually ask me this? Is there anything like a sort of inherent tension between religion, mythology on the one hand, and disability on the other hand? Okay. This will only be 1 or 2 minutes on a subject that could easily fill one entire class, of course. So there's the problem always of words and terminology. If you say disability, you sort of presuppose that there is something like an able body and then a not so able body. And a word like handicap is a word we do not use that often anymore in English nowadays. So I will be the first to admit that the whole idea of studying disability in the pre-industrial past is basically a sort of anachronism. Disability really came up in the 19th century nation states, which want to have healthy bodies, healthy citizens, and which sort of gave compensation in form of financial compensation or whatever for people who were not like perfectly healthy citizens. Now, it is, in a way, an anachronism, but I think that we can get away with this. In a way, it's an epistemological problem, meaning that there is the distinction between the emic, this is the view from inside, and the ethic, the view from outside. Just to put things simple, I think one can say that in every single culture, you will every now and then encounter people who cope with difficulties in seeing. So that is an obvious thing. In all cultures, you won't find people who cannot walk, for instance. That would be the ethic side of it. The emic side would be how such people were viewed within their culture. It's actually basically the very same thing than studying sexuality in the ancient world, which became very fashionable in the 70s of the last century. There is no Greek or Latin word to say sexuality, let alone homosexuality. From the ethic point of view, one could say, well, there were always men fancying men or women fancying women. That would be the ethic thing. The emic thing would be how these people were viewed within their culture. So it's actually very much the same thing for disabled people. What I also want to do is the ethical with the age issue. So I would move away from moralizing judgments and I start from a sort of realism about the condition humaine. And of course, let that be clear, from the universal character also of human rights. So that is a sort of moral standpoint I take, or I have taken in writing this book. Now, Greek and Roman mythology, Greek and Roman religion, what is this? Well, again, I try to summarize this in 2 pages in the book. This could take up a whole volume. What is religion in antiquity? I always say that if you want to compare it with the contemporary world, that the closest nowadays would be Hinduism, as we mainly find it in the East, if we start from our Western world, of course. So polytheistic religion, no dogmas being imposed, lots of choices which are basically there, lots of variety, and so on and so on. This would be, for me, religion in antiquity. What would be myths? I have defined myths as foundational stories, sort of ground stories that explain more about this religious system, which can be, as I said, very varied. So it's not like one system that is imposed on people, but you need stories, and these stories about that religion are called myths. Now, please be aware that there is not ever anything like a standard version, let alone a canon of myths. This is what I discovered during writing this booklet. I ended up with reading mythographers like Hyginus, or Apollodorus, the bibliotheke, so the library. It's full of different versions. And even when you read Homer, as we will see later on in this talk, there's different versions about a so-called disabled god like Hephaestus. So forget about one version. We do this, of course, because of didactic reasons, but there's many, many, many different versions of stories. Another cliche that I want to debunk here is that the Romans, whatever that might mean, did not have mythology while the Greeks had. That is, of course, not true. I'm one of these scholars that who believe that, for instance, the first book of Ab Urbe Condita by Titi Livy for the Romans had a sort of same value as a foundational story as the Iliad or the Odyssey by Homer for the Greeks. Another sort of cliche that I like to debunk in the book is that in Greek civilization, you would have had a sort of transition, which is sometimes compared to the Enlightenment, a sort of transition from mythos, myths, stories, to logos, philosophy, logical thinking. That's actually not true. Also, when you read Plato, when you read Aristotle, there's lots of belief also in what we would call the myths. So be careful with this cliche. Also be careful with another cliche. I can't go into this now in detail, but atheos in Greek does not mean someone who does not believe in gods. Yeah? So an atheos is not necessarily a contemporary atheist, not at all. I pretty much like the following comparison, which you find with Plutarch. And Plutarch in the 1st century CE actually says, truth stands in relation to myth as the sun stands in relation to the rainbow. So by seeing the rainbow, you understand something about the sun. By listening to, by reading myths, you sort of understand something about religious truth. And the inscription I put there on the right is actually an inscription in the end saying, if you dubitas, if you doubt that there is something like gods of the underworld, well, just have a look at what has happened here. So this is very much a religion also that believes that gods in one way or another function and work for us and for the world. Now, if you would just go out on the streets and ask people, can you name me some disabled heroes or gods in Greek and Roman or other mythologies, I'm sure that people would come up with many, many different stories. So here's for you. It's a sort of quiz, but please do not start answering now, because then the chat box would be full immediately. But on the left, you see, of course, Atlas, who is carrying the world on his shoulders. And you see Prometheus, whose liver must have been very painful for reasons you know. It's a sort of eternal punishment happening to him. On the right, you see on the right of the image also Aphrodite, Venus, and she is helping her son Aeneas in his fight against, on the left, Diomedes. Now, the interesting thing is that Aphrodite is hurt in this battle, that she goes back to the gods on the Olympus, and that she needs to be cured. There are other instances in which a god like Ares will tell Zeus, I'm so happy that you wanted to heal me. If not, I would have been anemenos, says the Greek, so something like without strength, without ability for the rest of my life. So gods can get hurt, gods can get wounded, and perhaps even disabled for the rest of their lives. As I said, I want to include more than just Greece and Rome. So if we go on the left again, this is blind Hodur, who was actually tricked by Loki into shooting an arrow. an arrow to Balder, who was said to have been immortal. He could only be hurt by the mistletoe. And of course, the arrow was made out of mistletoe. And so without knowing it, and he will be punished for it later on, blind Hodur will kill Balder. He will go to hell. This is interesting. One god going to the underworld, another god dying. In the Greek and Roman tradition, normally gods do not die, but it is here in Nordic mythology. It is described in the Edda. In Egyptian mythology, the god Horus lost his eye, the so-called Ujat eye, in his fight against his uncle Set, who had killed Father Osiris. And on the right, from the Sanskrit Vedic tradition, you see the god Bhaga, who in primordial sacrifice lost both of his eyes, but one eye was restored later on. So what I basically do in my book is offer an overview, as it is said in Latin, a capite ad calcem, so from head to toe, which means that I start with madness, which in Greek is often called mania. So what I do for each single case, I ask about the causes. So why does someone have this disability? I ask about how this disability is narrated, and I also ask about the possibility of a cure, which was, of course, not always there. Let that be clear. I start with Ajax, the Trojan hero, who was made mad as a punishment. And this was done by two gods. This was done by Pallas Athena, but also by a goddess who is sort of specialized in bringing mania. You see her on the right. This is the goddess called Lyssa. Okay, what happens? Ajax, as an hero, thinks he's fighting Odysseus. In reality, he's slaughtering his own sheep. When the mania gets away, he realizes what he has done, and there is the embarrassment, there is the shame, and he throws himself on his sword. So it explicitly says that he's so embarrassed by the laughter, everyone will laugh at him. And basically, this means that in this honorable society, he needs to put an end to his own life. Now, important to know, there is quite some bibliography on so-called mad gods, often mad goddesses. This doesn't exist in Greco-Roman mythology. So Lyssa, who brings madness, is never ever depicted as a mad goddess herself. Instead, she's often a young huntress, as you can see on the right. So I think that studying so-called madness in Greco-Roman and Greek and Roman mythology does not bring us that far. Surely if you want to compare it to the contemporary world, except for one thing. And that is when I give talks about disability in the ancient world, a question that always comes up, the question about post-traumatic stress disorder. And here is a beautiful example in a myth about Creusa, an Athenian princess, narrated in Euripides' Ion. This is really wonderful in one way. So Creusa had been raped by Apollo, and at a certain moment in her life, many years later, she has a sort of very painful flashback. Her son sees this, and he asks, well, mother, what's the matter? There's something wrong. Can you tell me? And she basically says, no, do not worry about me. There's nothing wrong with me. Okay, then, of course, the son continues asking, but are you sure there isn't anything wrong with you? And then she starts telling a story about a friend of her who had suffered a rape. This is what psychiatrists would call substitution. So you just tell the story as if it had happened to another person, while it is yourself, of course, it's your own story. The tragedy goes on. At a certain moment, Creusa realizes that she has to speak about what has happened, but the disclosure brings her anxiety and shame. But then in the end, she decides to relive the experience by telling about the abuse. Very interesting, in Euripides' play, she suddenly turns, in the Greek, to the present tense. Now here, and I've included this in the bibliography, so present-day psychologists dealing with trauma have pointed out to this particular case. And a play like Euripides' Ion has been used, for example, to deal with veterans, war veterans in the United States. And sometimes they have these people perform these plays in order to just sort of cope with the trauma which was there. So this would be an interesting case of myths, ancient myths, being relevant for a present-day contemporary context of what you could call trauma as a sort of disability. Okay, let's move on in our catalog. What about blindness? Was there anything as a blind god in Greek or Roman mythology? I would say yes, it is Plutus. Plutos, who is the god of wealth. It is Plutus as he appears in Aristophanes' play on wealth. So I apologize for the words now, but according to Aristophanes, Plutus stinks. He's mobility impaired. He's blind. And he even is circumcised. Now, why is this? Because, of course, wealth reaches out to the wrong people. Fortune is often something which is blind. Wealth comes slowly. It sometimes takes a whole life to build up your wealth. In other words, wealth is used here as a sort of allegory. The ancient writers realized this very well themselves. So this is from a scholion, a commentary, an ancient commentary on Aristophanes, where this is explicitly said. If you go to the 2nd century CE satirical writer Lucian in the Timon, you get the same image of Plutus as a blind and disabled god. But if you go to depictions of him, if you go to sacrifices being made for Plutus, this image doesn't appear at all. On the contrary, he's a young man and is often depicted with the cornucopia, so the sort of horn of abundance being there. So it's totally different, and it might be that this image of Plutus as a disabled and blind god is something which is really typical in a sort of allegorical tradition. But what about blind individuals in Greek mythology? Of course, there's a whole range of them. I'm not going to explain all these gruesome stories. I just want you to know that this blindness in mythology is always depicted as a gruesome punishment, as a very bad thing. One of the most striking examples is the punishment of Polymestor, the Thracian king, in Euripides' Hecuba. What had happened? Well, Polymestor had actually killed Hecuba's son, Polydorus, who was entrusted to him. So as a kind of revenge, Hecuba invites Polymestor to her tent, and she literally scratches out his eyes. Of course, you don't see this happening on stage, but in Euripides' play, you just hear Polymestor's crying, screaming when this happens to him. And also later on, so his blindness is depicted as something really horrible that happened to him. Same, of course, for the story of Oedipus that I don't need to tell you, I guess, but also there. So up to late antiquity, there is never a sort of allegorical explanation of Oedipus's blindness. I do not know of any author up to late antiquity saying, well, thanks to his blindness, Oedipus saw certain things better. He realized some things better. This is discourse you sometimes find in late antiquity in Christian discourse, but not so much for Oedipus, but it's not there with the ancient Greek and Latin authors. There's others, of course. Why is the seer Tiresias, why is he actually blind? Again, there's many stories about this, but they all come down to the same thing. It's divine punishment. There's one interesting story that he would have seen two snakes copulating, for which he was punished. And the punishment was that for a certain time in his life, he was transformed into a woman. Zeus restored this, so he became a man again. And then the gods asked him, tell me, who has more pleasure in sexual intercourse? You have lived as a woman and as a man. Can you tell us? And then Tiresias reveals the big secret. He says, it's actually women who enjoy most. And then, as a punishment, he is made blind. That is just one of the many versions about his blindness. Now, however you want to look at it, so basically in mythology, Tiresias survives in 4 generations in the city of Thebes, but already in the first generation, he's depicted as an old and wise seer. So the point that I want to make in my book is that he is very much respected. He's very much seen as the wise old man. It is said indeed that the gods sort of compensated for his blindness by making him a brilliant seer. But it is never said, as far as I could understand the text, that he is a good seer because of his blindness. It is rather despite of his blindness or in addition to his blindness. And the testimonies are really interesting because the writers think about all sorts of practicalities. A seer should also watch the birds. So how can a blind man watch the birds? Well, of course, there's a young boy who can help you. There's all sorts of information about his walking around, his using a staff, his having servant boys, and so on and so on. So all the practicalities are basically being described. But the bottom line of the story would be that blindness by itself is a punishment, and it's certainly not a gift that gave him the skill of divination. What about not hearing? This is interesting again. So I really read widely, comparatively, and I found hardly any instances, also in other cultures, of gods not hearing. There's some things, Harpocrates and silence, and these things are mentioned, but that is, of course, not the same as being completely deaf. Now, interesting is that there is a whole tradition on not being able to speak. And here is one striking story which you find in the Alia, described in a beautiful way by Ovid in his Fasti. So this is about Lara, also called Larunda, and for those of you who study languages, Lara is of course related with Lala, which means lalel, lalen, so to speak. So actually, Lala or Lara had seen Jupiter, who was having an affair with another nymph, Juturna. And as a punishment for this, she was struck by muteness by Jupiter Zeus, and she was sent to the underworld. Mercurius, who has to guide her to the underworld, takes advantage of her not being able to speak, and he rapes her. And she can hardly speak out about the horrible thing that had happened to her. There's more. Ovid describes a festival, a Roman festival, the Feralia, which happens on the 21st of February, and which is a festival sort of offering people protection against pollution being brought by the evil eye, or what you could call the evil tongue. So people just gossiping about you. And I guess you immediately notice the relation with or to mute Lara, Larunda. What about mobility impairments? Of course, the first idea would be Hephaestus, obviously. Well, what I point out in the little booklet is that with Homer, only with Homer, you find three very different Hephaestuses, to say so. Iliad 1 is, according to some writers, the passage or the excerpt where you find the first description of disability in Western literature. It's about the anger of Zeus. It's a story about domestic violence. So Hera is having a quarrel with Zeus, and could I ask you all to mute because there's some interfering sound and I can't see where it comes from. Okay, thank you. So Hera is having troubles with her husband, and then Hephaestus says, "Mother, please be quiet. Otherwise, he will punish you. He will beat you, as he did to me once when I was a young child. He threw me out of the Olympus. I flew for a whole day, and of course, by accident, I fell down on the Isle of Lemnos, and I ended up disabled." And when he tells this story, all the other gods basically laugh when he's walking around like limping. That is a very peculiar excerpt you find in the first chant of the Iliad. Now in chant 18, there's a different Hephaestus, because there it is explicitly said that his mother did not like him because he was born deformed with what we would call a congenital disability. And he, in Iliad 18, is visited by Thetis, who had taken care of him when he was a young child. He's living in Lemnos too. He's living, isn't that remarkable? He's, of course, is a blacksmith. He's what we would call an engineer. So he's living in a house full of automata. So sort of puppets, sort of statues who sort of walk around by wheels, sort of automatic tools which he has created. And he has a beautiful wife. She's called Charis. That's another version. And then there is yet another version about Hephaestus being disabled, being married to the goddess of love and sexuality, being married to Aphrodite, who cheats on him. So she is having an affair with Ares, the god of war. The two together are in bed, and then Hephaestus just throws a net over the couple, and they can't get out of the net anymore, and all gods are invited to see the spectacle. Ares and Aphrodite being caught in the act. I always thought that the story was like this. All gods can come and see the spectacle. If you go through the text, you will see that it's only the male gods who were allowed to see this spectacle. Females did not, the goddesses did not want to come. And then there is another tradition, which you find in many different ancient testimonies. It's about him, Hephaestus, taking revenge on his mother, which you see on this beautiful vase from Puglia. She's actually chained in a sort of comfortable chair. She sits down and then she's chained, and no one can make her loose again. Here's Hephaestus on the left. He's actually also depicted with small stature as a sort of dwarf, as we would have called it some decades ago. And so the gods need to make Hephaestus drunk. Drunkenness is the only solution, and then eventually he will let his mother go. So drunkenness comes up often. This is again the image of the komoi, the so-called paddled dancers, who are often also associated to Hephaestus. On the other hand, there's many images of Hephaestus where you do not see any disability at all. Stories, individuals, myths. Here's Philoctetes, one of the Trojan heroes. His arrows were needed for the Greeks to be able to conquer the city of Troy. He's sometimes called a new Hephaestus. Again, his illness, his disability is brought on him by the gods. He has a snake biting him. The wound has horrible stench, and for this he is put in exile again, the new Hephaestus, on the Isle of Lemnos. He's there for years. And the interesting thing is when the Greeks come, and when they sort of ask him, would you come back because we need you for the siege of Troy? The injury matters again. So when there's negotiations, then it's suddenly, oh, it hurts, I cannot do this. And in other instances, there seems to be no injury anymore. Be this as it may, again, the element of disgust. So no one wants to see this horrible wound, which by the way made him mobility impaired also. No one wants to see this. And there's the strong idea also of it being a punishment of the gods. So Georges Dumézil, who has been translated in English too, is really classic for a topic like this. Georges Dumézil has written extensively about cases like Philoctetes and others. So he will basically say that behind these stories always is the idea of recompensation and sacrifice. So just from left to right, we see Mucius Scaevola, who in Roman mythology lost his right hand. He had it burned when he was facing the Etruscan king Porsena. There's an Irish story about Tuatha de Danann, about Nuada, who actually could not be the king anymore because he did not have his right hand anymore. It is replaced by silver prosthesis, and then he becomes the king of the tribe of the Danann again. In the Edda, left below, is Tyr, who actually lost his right hand again when he put it in the mouth of the wolf Ferir. And in Vedic mythology, there's the goddess Savit, who actually lost her both hands in primordial, as it is called, sacrifice. One hand later on was recompensated again by a sort of prosthesis. Okay, what about what I've called in my third chapter other oddities? Well, of course, they are all around. These are all children of Uranus and Gaia. So the Titans, the ones with 100 hands, the Hecatoncheires, the Cyclops, children of Uranus and Gaia. They are in the stories not at all impaired. So Dumézil would say that there is a strong link between so-called monstrosity and sovereignty. They existed, according to the ancient writers. This is interesting again, but writers would say, well, actually a centaur exists. A cyclops exists. This is there. This is not just fictional stories. They are very, very seldom worshipped, and surely not in the so-called monstrous form or image. They are depicted in many different ways. So there's many different literary genres also taking advantage of these monsters. And I have some reflections in my book also on the identity of social groups. People being nicknamed Cyclops. To begin with, Philip of Macedonia. What would this mean if they call you a Cyclops? What about the tradition of the so-called monsters at the imperial court, at the court of Heliogabalus? So the story says that after Heliogabalus's death, these individuals were released. But they were all sent to different towns because they didn't want to have them together. What is this? Would these people have been together? And some said about themselves, we were the monsters of Heliogabalus and we belong together. What about individuals who were sort of forced to be in the amphitheater as so-called pygmies? Things like this. Would this sort of have influenced their sense of identity? There's a particularly beautiful poetic tradition also about the Cyclops Polyphemus, who is courting Galatea, and who actually says, look, I'm not disabled. Isn't this eye very beautiful? Aren't my eyebrows very special? Don't you like me the way I am? So we can imagine all sorts of scenarios there. I skip this now because otherwise it would be 10 minutes only for this slide. But there is also a tradition on what is often called in the ancient sources nanoi or nani, so-called dwarfs. A very strong tradition is the one on Bes, the Egyptian God. This is interesting, was very popular also in Greek and Roman times, and some people try to make the point that Bes might even represent individuals with Down syndrome, which I do not believe at all. I think the depiction and veneration also of Bes is much more a sort of celebration of pluriformity. So Bes appears in many different pictures, images too. So I don't really believe that you can do any retrospective diagnosis here. Twins and multiplets in mythology often turn up in the context of hyperfertility. Even in the context of a woman being made pregnant by a god and by her husband. And then the tradition, of course, of two babies, the one being the creation by the god and the other being the weaker part of the twins. And in a way, that weaker part can be somehow disabled. You find it in the tradition about Heracles and Iphicles, of course. And then an interesting thought too, but again, it would be a whole presentation, is old age every now and then considered a disability? Well, sometimes it is, because as you all know, Greek and Roman gods do not get old. Tithonus asked for himself for immortality, but he forgot to ask about eternal youth. So he sort of faded away, became old, shriveled, and nothing was left of him. And according to Hesiodus, the golden race, so the first race which was there in humankind, they just died, but they never experienced old age. Okay, the fourth chapter is about the so-called requirement of able bodies. Again, I invite you to read the details in the little book. Interesting, there are 3 or 4 texts claiming this. That is, a priest must be without defect. Sacerdos integer sit. A priest whose body has a blemish is to be avoided like something of an ill omen, and so on and so on. But this is just an excerpt from the Controversiae of Seneca the Elder. It belongs into a series of remarks about priests actually coping with a disability. So the bottom line of the story is that there is this sort of ideal image of harmony in nature, which should be reflected also in religious practice. In fact, it was much more about coping with reality. In the book, I offer like 5 or 6 examples of priests having difficulties with pronouncing words, stammering, the priest missing one hand, and so on and so on, but they could still perform their duties. So I would actually not buy the argument, which was believed in the end of the 19th, early 20th century, that antiquity, Greco-Roman tradition had that idea of purity and priests, physical purity, whatever that may mean. I think in practice, there were lots of other solutions. Now, interesting, in chapter 5, I focus on the so-called Theologia Mythica, which you already find with pagan writers like Varro or Dionysius of Halicarnassos. They will basically say that these mythological stories cannot be true in the literal sense, that we need to go to the truth which is behind the stories. And this is actually what Christian critics will do very much too. So they, in their criticism of paganism, will focus more on anthropomorphism and not so much on gods or heroes with impairments. That only plays a very minor role in their discourse of critics, which is interesting, of course, because if you want to criticize Greco-Roman mythology, you could say, well, what is this, a god with a disability, and this doesn't make sense. Well, you hardly find this in the early Christian discourse. Moreover, Saint Augustine, Saint Jerome, and all these writers, they also believe in the existence of what I've called oddities. So what you see depicted on the right is the Eremite Paul, who at the age of 113 in the desert meets a centaur. And this is not dished up as a sort of funny story by Jerome, and also St. Augustine will say, well, also people with so-called deformities are actually part of the plan of God, part of the creation. I dared to include in my book also this discussion on Christianity, because there's lots of mythology also in this early Christianity. And in a way, the miracles of Jesus Christ also function as foundational stories. So what changes here? Of course, you get certain categories of people sort of having the likelihood of being healed, as Jesus held the blind, the deaf, the mute, the people who cannot walk, so the so-called lame, the leprous, and so the possessed. So these categories come up time and again also in hagiography. And there's, of course, much more than in paganism, these nagging questions about why is this? Why does my child have this? If there's only one God, who is responsible for this? This is also a religion in which the mutilated body, as Candida Moss has called it, has become more important. Perhaps it's a sort of inverted idea of the ancient Kalokagatia. And what about Judgment Day? Will we all rise with perfect bodies? So what does this mean? Does it mean that when I've been blind all my life, that this blindness doesn't really matter to God? That this is not who I really am in essence? Or does it ignore this suffering which has been there in life? There's all sorts of things you can do with the idea of rising with perfect bodies. What is actually a perfect body? And then in early Christian mythology, there's a strong emphasis on so-called ugly, evil characters being in hell. And the excellent book by Megan Henning called Hell Had No Fury actually deals with this. So why is it actually that so-called damned bodies are represented as the bad guys, the ones who are in hell? And does this imply a sort of strong moral judgment about so-called deformity? That is, of course, a huge question. I come to a conclusion. The website We Capable is a fascinating website about which I can hardly judge. Why? Because it is about Vedic, so Indian mythology. And the writer of this We Capable website makes the point that you have so many, he calls disabled divinities and gods in Vedic mythology, that this mythology sort of celebrates the diversity which is there in human existence. Can we actually do the same for Greco-Roman myths? I don't think so. I think I've proven in my presentation, in my book, that there is not many examples of so-called disabled gods. And there are, of course, lots of so-called disabled individuals in Greek and Roman mythology, but I'm not sure whether this is always meant as a celebration of diversity. I talked to about this to one of the very few scholars of Vedic and Sanskrit language we still have. And he told me that perhaps 1 out of 1,000 Vedic texts have a proper, good critical edition, let alone a translation or a good commentary. And I was wondering, we have this rich tradition, so for what the Germans called Altertumswissenschaft already from the 19th century, we have all these encyclopedias, we can study all this. Study of Vedic mythology is just in its very, very early beginnings, and one wonders whether you can really make this point about the great diversity which is there. I'm of course not able to judge there, but it's interesting to just to think about it. I would very much like to make the point that we, people in the contemporary Western world, that we are very much obsessed with what we call perfect bodies. And I told this to many journalists already. I experienced that very strongly when a year or 5 or 6 ago, I happened to be like 2 weeks in Iran for a cultural travel, and went back, arrived in the airport, was in Brussels, And the first thing you notice after having been 2 weeks abroad in such a different culture, you see these bodies, nakedness, like everywhere. You just enter an airport, there's all these advertisements of so-called perfect, beautiful bodies, which is a thing you don't see in that Persian culture. So I think it's interesting just to reflect on this. We are used by social media, by television, by always watching such so-called perfect bodies. Now, I think that the ancient stance on this was very, very different, and I have called it a sort of casual take. When Galen discusses perfection, harmony, the so-called prepon, he basically says, well, don't we all want to be healthy? We don't like to miss a limb. We like to walk on both legs. In my view, he isn't really judging about people experiencing this disability. So this is a very different take on matters. Just because of the fact that, think about this, in antiquity, when would you have seen so-called perfect bodies? I just saw that Anastasia Mentani was or is among the audience, so I feel honored about the presence, because this is a book that I would greatly recommend. So the grotesque body in Greco-Roman antiquity, it really goes against this image we have of ancient sculpture, that is mostly just classical sculpture, representing harmony and beauty. There were thousands of other statuettes, of which you see 2 depictions here. And that puts the whole idea of perfection of bodies in a totally different context. I think that most people in antiquity would have a very realistic view on things, saying, well, these perfect bodies, where are they? We basically all have our struggles. We all have our difficulties. It's not a thing you prefer. It can happen to you, as it can happen to the gods, who were very much part of the world too. So I'd like to end with this image. I think this says it all. It comes from Antakya, so I hope it survived the horrible earthquake of a year ago. It's a mosaic, and it basically says, Kaisu, you too. And look at his fellow. He's sort of staring at us, and he's saying, don't laugh too much at me, because a sort of disability can happen to you too. So I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I would also like to extend an invitation to have a look at my website, The Disability History and the Ancient World, where there is a huge bibliography, and where I should say we, so Lisa Brunet, who is my PhD, my first PhD student from Manchester. She's now in Basel. So where Lisa Brunet and I sort of bring together the scholars all over the world dealing with this fascinating topic. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for this fantastic lecture, Christian. So many interesting points and many questions that no doubt are percolating among the audience. So
yeah, I see some question in the chat coming already. So yeah, I leave it to you, Anna. So you're the boss now.
Thank you so much. Let's get started on the questions asked already in the chat.